My husband faked stage 4 cancer to steal my $3 million inheritance. After he went to prison for 60 years, I discovered his dead man switch was attacking my life from his cell, so I performed the ultimate digital autopsy to liquidate his legacy forever. The air in the consultant's office was so still it felt pressurized. I remember the way the sunlight hit the dust motes dancing over the mahogany desk, a mundane beauty that felt insulting given the gravity of the moment. Mark sat beside me, his fingers interlaced with mine so tightly his knuckles were white. He was trembling, a rhythmic, subtle shudder that I felt deep in my own bones. Across from us sat Dr. Eris Thorne, a man with a silver beard and a voice like velvet over gravel. He didn't look at me, he looked at the manila folder between us. "The results of the biopsy and the spinal tap are conclusive," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's a rare variant of neuroblastoma, typically seen in infants, but in adults, it is extraordinarily aggressive. We are looking at stage 4. It has already begun to migrate to the lymph nodes." The world didn't tilt, it simply inverted. I felt a cold, sharp vacuum open in my chest. Mark let out a sound, a broken, choked sob, and buried his face in his hands. "No," he whispered. "No, Sarah. We were supposed to have 40 more years. We were supposed to see the world." I pulled him to me, holding his head against my shoulder, feeling the dampness of his tears through my silk blouse. I was a software architect, a woman who solved problems with logic and code. My brain immediately shifted into fix-it mode, a defense mechanism against the sheer terror of losing the only man I had ever truly loved. I looked at Dr. Thorne, my eyes hard and dry. "What are the options? Money is not an issue. I want the best surgeons, the most experimental trials, the most advanced technology on the planet." I had inherited nearly $3 million from my father's estate a year prior, a fund we had intended to use for a dream home. In that office, that money transformed from a dream into a weapon. I would spend every cent to buy Mark another breath. I didn't see the fleeting microscopic glance Mark exchanged with the doctor. I didn't know that Dr. Thorne was actually Gary, a former medical equipment salesman who had lost his license for fraud, or that the biopsy results were a Photoshop job created on our home computer while I was at work. The following weeks were a descent into a specialized kind of hell. Mark's decline was terrifyingly rapid. He began to lose weight, not through the ravages of disease, but through a calculated regime of fasting and a hidden stash of diuretics. He stopped shaving, his beard growing in patchy and gray, and he began to apply a subtle, sallow-toned theatrical makeup to his skin before I woke up each morning. Our home, once a place of light and laughter, became a makeshift hospice. I spent $60,000 in the first month alone, transforming our guest suite into a sterile environment with HEPA filters, heart monitors, and oxygen concentrators that Mark had insisted on. "I don't want to go to a hospital, Sarah," he'd whispered, his voice a ghost of its former self. "I want to be with you. I want to die in your arms, not under fluorescent lights." It was the ultimate emotional trap. By keeping his treatment at home, he ensured that no actual medical professionals would ever lay eyes on him. I became his primary caregiver, his nurse, and his financier. I was working 18-hour days, managing high-stakes architectural projects for global firms during the day, and sitting by his bedside at night, tracking his vitals on a custom dashboard he had asked me to build for him. He had me link the dashboard to a Swiss research portal, a website that looked incredibly professional, filled with peer-reviewed articles and live data from a clinic in Zurich. I would sit in the dim glow of my monitors, watching the white blood cell count fluctuate, feeling a desperate surge of hope every time a graph trended upward. I was a genius at code, yet I was a fool at life. I never checked the source code of that portal. I never realized that the live data was a randomized script Mark had written to keep me engaged. I was coding the very prison that was being used to cage my life and my fortune. In November, Mark introduced the miracle option. He claimed Dr. Thorne had found a breakthrough gene editing trial at the Institut de Vie in Zurich. "It's our only chance, Sarah, but it's off book. The Swiss government hasn't fully sanctioned it yet, so it's cash only. No insurance. No paper trail." He showed me the acceptance letter on my laptop. The cost was astronomical, a $200,000 entrance fee and $50,000 per cycle of treatment. I didn't blink. I initiated the wire transfer that afternoon. To me, the money was just numbers on a screen. Mark was my heart. A specialized medical transport company, another front, arrived to take him to the airport every 3 weeks. I would walk him to the van, his frail body wrapped in blankets, his head covered by a beanie to hide his hair loss. I wasn't allowed to accompany him because of the extreme immunosuppression protocol the clinic supposedly enforced. "I'll fight for you, Sarah," he'd say, his eyes moist as the van doors closed. While I spent those weeks in a state of suspended animation, barely eating, barely sleeping, and pouring all my energy into making more money to fund the next cycle, Mark was living a life of unimaginable decadence. He wasn't in Zurich. The van would drive him to a private hangar where a jet, paid for by my treatment fees, would fly him to a villa in the Turks and Caicos. There, he shed the beanie and the robe, revealing a tanned, muscular body that he maintained with a portable gym. He was joined by Nurse Tiffany, a woman I had met briefly at Dr. Thorne's office, who was actually his mistress of 3 years. They spent my father's inheritance on vintage wine, jet skis, and planning their post-Sarah life. The first crack in the facade wasn't a grand revelation, but a technological glitch. I was at my desk at 2 odd a.m., working on a skyscraper design for a firm in Dubai. My mind was foggy from exhaustion. To feel closer to Mark while he was in Zurich, I often looked at old photos of us on our shared cloud drive. As I navigated the folders, I noticed a synchronization error. A folder titled Asset Liquidation had been modified only an hour ago. I frowned. Mark was supposed to be in a drug-induced coma for his third gene splice cycle. I opened the folder, expecting to see our old tax returns. Instead, I found a subfolder labeled The Transition. Inside was a PDF titled Estate Plan Draft Final. I opened it, and the breath left my body. It wasn't a plan for his death, it was a plan for mine. It detailed a legal strategy to have me declared mentally unfit due to prolonged grief and caregiver burnout, a move that would grant Mark sole control over the remaining $2 million of my inheritance and our house. But even then, my brain refused to accept the truth. I thought maybe he's just scared. Maybe he's trying to protect the money in case I lose it. I was so deep in the caregiver mindset that I was making excuses for my own executioner. But then I saw a thumbnail of a video file. I clicked it. It was a live feed from a security camera, the one I had installed in our bedroom to monitor him while I worked. The date stamp was from 3 days ago when he was supposed to be in Switzerland. The video showed Mark standing in our bedroom, vibrant and healthy, drinking a beer and talking on a burner phone. "She's almost tapped out," he said into the phone, laughing. "One more emergency surgery should do it. Then we trigger the mental health clause. I'll see you at the villa, babe." I didn't scream. I didn't throw my laptop across the room. Something in me, perhaps the part of me that understood how to debug a failing system, simply clicked shut. The woman who loved Mark died in that chair at 2:05 a.m. In her place was a software architect who saw a massive, malicious bug in her life's code. I sat perfectly still for an hour, watching the dust motes again, but this time they looked like pixels in a failing simulation. I knew that if I confronted him now, he would flee. He had the jet, the offshore accounts, and the mistress. I would be left with a mountain of debt and no proof. I needed to let him think he was still the predator and I was still the prey. I needed to feed his ego until it was too big to fit through the exit. I pulled up my banking app and saw a pending request for another $50,000 for an emergency cytokine storm treatment. My hand shook as I hit approve. Eat, Mark, I thought. Engorge yourself on my father's money. It's the last meal you'll ever have. I called a contact I had from my days doing security consulting for the government, a man named Elias who specialized in invisible investigations. "Elias," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone, "I need you to perform a total audit of a dead man. I want to know where every cent went, who Nurse Tiffany is, and I want eyes on that Swiss clinic. I think my husband is a miracle of science, and I want to document it." Elias was a ghost who lived in the deep web, and by the next evening, he had provided me with a dossier that read like a psychological thriller. Mark hadn't just faked a disease, he had faked a history. He had never graduated from the university he claimed to have attended. His previous business failures were actually successful scams where he had drained the accounts of 2 other women before disappearing. I was his big score, the one with the $3 million inheritance. "The Swiss clinic is a shell company registered to a mailbox in the Caymans," Elias whispered over an encrypted line. "The limo service that picks him up is owned by a guy who used to do security for a cartel. And your husband? He's currently at a 5-star resort in the Turks, charging a $10,000 dinner to your medical emergency credit card. He's with a woman named Tiffany Vance. She's not a nurse, she's a high-end escort he's put on a permanent retainer." I looked at the photos Elias sent. Mark on a jet ski, his cancer-riddled body glowing with health and expensive sunblock. I felt a surge of nausea so strong I had to grip the edge of my desk. He wasn't just stealing my money, he was stealing my grief. He had watched me cry myself to sleep for months, watched me skip meals to pay for his life, and he had laughed about it. He had turned my love into a commodity. I told Elias to keep watching. I wanted the proposal to the mistress. I wanted the forged documents for the mental fitness hearing. I wanted it all on 4K video. As if the financial and emotional betrayal wasn't enough, Elias uncovered the surrogate gambit. Mark and I had been struggling to conceive before his diagnosis, and we had supposedly hired a surrogate through a boutique agency. Mark had handled all the paperwork, claiming he wanted to take the stress off me. "The surrogate, Elena, isn't from an agency," Elias revealed. "She's Tiffany's younger sister. They've drafted a contract that lists Mark as the sole biological and legal parent, using a forged waiver of your maternal rights. They're planning to use the mental fitness ruling to prove you're an unfit mother, take the baby and the remaining cash, and move to a non-extradition country the moment the miracle occurs." I felt a coldness settle into my marrow. He was planning to steal my future child. My father's money was being used to buy the very person who would replace me. I realized then that Mark wasn't just a con artist. He was a social engineer. He had mapped out my every emotional trigger and pulled them in sequence. But he had made one fatal error. He assumed I was a primary unit that could be overwritten. He forgot that I was the one who built the systems he was trying to hack. Mark returned from Zurich on a Tuesday, looking miraculously better. He stepped out of the van with a light in his eyes that he tried to dim the moment he saw me. "Sarah," he whispered, pulling me into a hug that felt like being wrapped in a shroud. "The doctors, they're using the word remission. The gene therapy, it's a miracle. I'm coming back to you." I buried my face in his chest, pretending to sob with joy, while in reality, I was counting his pulse. It was steady, strong, and disgustingly healthy. "Oh, Mark, I knew it. I knew the money didn't matter," I cried into his silk shirt. He patted my back, his eyes already scanning the room, likely looking for his burner phone. He told me the clinic needed one final infusion to lock in the remission, a $500,000 golden bullet treatment. "Once this is done, Sarah, we can sell this place. We can move to the coast. Just us, a fresh start." I looked at him and saw the predator's hunger. He was ready to clear the table and leave the restaurant. I smiled, my eyes bright with fake tears. "Anything, Mark. Whatever it takes to keep you here. I'll liquidate the last of the bonds tomorrow." I told Mark I wanted to throw a celebration of life dinner before his final treatment. "I want Dr. Thorne there. I want the people who saved you to see us happy." Mark hesitated, his con artist instincts flickering, but his ego won. He wanted to parade his victory in front of his accomplice. He thought it would be a victory lap. I spent the next 3 days working with Elias to turn our dining room into a high-tech courtroom. I hid cameras in the floral arrangements, microphones in the chandelier, and I had the large screen TV in the living room synced to my laptop. I invited Dr. Thorne, Gary, and Nurse Tiffany, telling Mark I'd hired her as a thank you for her care. The night of the dinner, Mark was radiant. He was wearing a $3,000 suit I'd bought him for our 5th anniversary. Gary arrived in his doctor costume, looking smug. Tiffany arrived in a modest dress, playing the dedicated professional. We sat around the table, drinking the champagne I'd bought with the last of my unstolen money. "A toast," Mark said, raising his glass, "to the miracle of science, and to the woman who made it all possible." I stood up, my glass held high. The room went quiet. "A toast," I echoed. "But not to science. I want to toast to the architecture of the abyss. To the man who taught me that you can build a whole world out of lies if the person watching wants to believe them." Mark's smile faltered. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" I picked up the remote on the table and hit the power button. The large screen in the living room flickered to life. It wasn't a slideshow of our wedding. It was the video of Mark doing push-ups in our bedroom. Then it was the footage of him on the jet ski in the Turks. Then it was the spreadsheet of the transition, showing his plan to have me institutionalized. The silence that followed was heavy, oily, and absolute. Gary stood up, his face ashen. Tiffany looked like she was going to bolt for the door. Mark sat perfectly still, his glass still raised, his mask finally irrevocably shattered. I looked at him, and for the first time in a year, I felt no pain. I only felt the satisfaction of a clean, bug-free system. "The $500,000 you asked for, Mark? It didn't go to Zurich," I said, leaning over the table until I was inches from his face. "It went to a private security firm and a team of federal prosecutors. And the champagne you're drinking? It's the last thing you'll ever taste that isn't from a plastic tray." The dining room felt like the interior of a tomb. The footage on the screen continued to loop. Mark laughing, the clink of glasses in the Caribbean, the cold, clinical text of the asset liquidation plan. Mark's glass was still hovering in midair, his hand frozen as if the champagne had turned to lead. Gary, the fake doctor, was the first to break. He pushed his chair back with a violent screech, his face a mottled purple. "I'm out. This wasn't part of the deal, Mark. You said she was a walkover. You said she was too emotional to look at the logs." "Sit down, Gary," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through his panic like a scalpel. "The doors are magnetically locked. The police are already in the driveway, but they've agreed to give me 15 minutes. You see, I'm a software architect. I like to understand the logic flow of a failure before I patch it. I want to hear it from you. How much was your cut?" Gary looked at Mark, then back at me. The professional consultant facade had evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, middle-aged fraudster. "200,000, he stammered. "He promised me a percentage of the final estate. He said you were disturbed, and it was a mercy to take the money before you wasted it on grief." I turned my gaze to Tiffany. She wasn't crying. She was calculating. She was looking for a window, a weakness, a way to spin this. "And you, Tiffany, the dedicated nurse and future mother of my stolen child, what was your price?" Tiffany leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She dropped the sweet nurse act entirely, revealing a sharp, jagged edge of malice. "My price was a life, Sarah. A real one. Not this sterile tech bro fantasy you live in. Mark hates you. He hates the way you analyze everything. He hates the way you made him feel like a project to be optimized. With me, he's a man. And as for the baby, Elena is already 6 months along. That child is legally his. You can put us in jail, but you'll never be a mother. That's the one thing your code can't fix." I felt the sting of her words, a heat rising in my throat, but I forced it down. I had anticipated this move. "You're right about the code, Tiffany. It can't make a baby, but it can trace a bloodline." I pulled up a new document on the screen, a DNA sequencing report Elias had obtained from the fertility clinic Mark had With Mark and Gary in custody, the focus shifted to Elena, the woman carrying the child Mark had intended to use as a pawn. She was hiding in a safe house Tiffany had set up in a neighboring state. I didn't send the police for her. I sent a courier with a single envelope. Inside was a copy of the DNA report and a letter. Elena, the letter read, "You are carrying a child for a man who lied to you about his biology and a man who is currently facing 20 years for wire fraud. You are a victim of their social engineering just as much as I was. You have two choices. You can stay in that safe house and wait for the feds to find you as a co-conspirator, or you can meet me." 2 days later, she showed up at a quiet park. She was young, barely 21, and terrified. She looked at my face, searching for the monster Mark had described. "He told me you were crazy," she whispered. "He told me you tried to poison him because you were jealous of his health." I handed her a bottle of water. "Mark says whatever the user needs to hear to keep the program running. But I'm not here to talk about Mark. I'm here to talk about the baby. It's not his, it's Gary's. And Gary is going to prison for a long time." I spent the next month working with a team of lawyers to do something Mark never expected. I offered to adopt the child. "I have the resources to give this baby a life," I told Elena. "And I have the legal standing to ensure Gary never touches a cent of my estate through this child. If you agree to a legal severance of parental rights in favor of a closed adoption, I will drop the co-conspirator charges against you and Tiffany. I'll set up a trust for your education. You get a clean slate. The baby gets a home." Elena cried for hours. She wasn't a criminal. She was a girl who had been manipulated by her older sister and a charismatic sociopath. She saw the miracle for what it was, a house of cards built on the suffering of others. She signed the papers. But Tiffany wasn't so easy. From her jail cell, she began a smear campaign, leaking emails, forged of course, that suggested I had known about the fraud and was using it to buy a baby. She was trying to trigger the mental health clause Mark had written, hoping to invalidate the adoption. She was still playing the game, even from behind bars. The smear campaign was sophisticated. Nurse Tiffany had been more than just an escort. She was a talented social engineer herself. My clients started calling. The architectural firms I worked for began to review our contracts. My reputation, the foundation of my career, was being systematically eroded by a woman with nothing left to lose. I sat in my office, the same place where I'd watched the dust motes, and realized I couldn't defend myself with traditional PR. I had to go into the source code of the smear. I called Elias. "Find the server that's hosting these leaks. I want the IP logs. I want to know who's paying the independent journalists to run these stories." Elias found the link in 48 hours. The money wasn't coming from Tiffany's frozen accounts. It was coming from a dead man's switch, a hidden Bitcoin wallet Mark had set up years ago, triggered to release funds if his heartbeat sensor, the one I had installed, stopped transmitting for more than 30 days. He was attacking me from his prison cell using the very technology I had used to save him. To stop the leaks, I had to resurrect Mark's heartbeat. It was a bizarre, poetic irony. I took the medical sensor I had used to monitor his cancer and hooked it up to a simple oscillating motor in my lab. I programmed the motor to mimic a resting human heart rate, 72 beats per minute. I re-established the link to the Swiss research portal, which was still active on a dark web server. As the heartbeat resumed, the dead man's switch paused. The flow of Bitcoin to the journalists dried up. The leaks stopped as the mercenaries realized their payroll had gone silent. But I didn't stop there. I used the connection to trace the switch back to its origin. It led to a small, unassuming credit union in Mark's hometown, a place he had never mentioned. Inside a safe deposit box there, we found the seed phrase for his entire offshore empire, and something far more valuable, a physical journal. Mark, for all his digital prowess, was a man who loved to document his genius. The journal was a step-by-step guide to every woman he had ever destroyed. The journal was a map of a graveyard. There were 6 women before me. 2 had committed suicide after being drained of their savings. 1 was in a state-run mental institution. 3 others had simply disappeared into poverty. Mark had been doing this for 15 years, refining his medical miracle scam with each iteration. I didn't give the journal to the police immediately. I used it to find the women who were still alive. I flew to a small town in Ohio to meet wife number 3, a woman named Claire who had once been a brilliant surgeon. Mark had used a failing kidney scam on her, convincing her to perform an illegal transplant in a private clinic that turned out to be a warehouse. She had lost her license and her sanity. Seeing Claire was like looking into a dark mirror of what I could have become. "He's a virus, Sarah," she said, her hands shaking as she held the coffee cup. "He doesn't just take your money. He takes yourself. He makes you doubt the very fabric of reality." I sat with her, sharing my story, and for the first time, I felt a sense of community. I wasn't a victim. I was part of a resistance. The trial of the people versus Mark Vance was the trial of the decade in the tech world. Mark tried to represent himself, claiming medical necessity and extreme emotional distress. He looked haggard in his orange jumpsuit, the remission he had claimed now replaced by the actual gray pallor of a man who hadn't seen the sun in months. I was the star witness. When I stepped onto the stand, I didn't look like the broken caregiver he had tried to create. I wore a power suit, my hair pulled back, my eyes cold and clear. Mark tried to cross-examine me. "Sarah," he said, his voice trying to find that old velvet charm. "Don't you remember the nights we spent planning our future? Don't you remember the love?" "I remember the code, Mark," I replied, my voice echoing in the courtroom. "I remember the way you used my father's death as a data point for your social engineering algorithm. I remember the way you calculated the expected value of my grief. You didn't love me. You were The sound of the gavel had been a sharp, decisive punctuation mark, but the silence that followed the trial was far more profound. I returned to my home, the place that had once been a stage for a dying man's performance, and I realized I couldn't live within those walls anymore. Every corner of the house was haunted by the logic of deceit. I put the property on the market and watched as this sterile environment I had built for $60,000 was dismantled by a crew of contractors. They ripped out the HEPA filters and the oxygen lines, physical manifestations of Mark's lies, and for the first time in years, the house felt like it could breathe. I moved to a smaller modern apartment in the city, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the skyline. It was a home built on transparency. In the guest room, I set up a nursery for the baby, whom I had legally named Maya, a name meaning illusion, a reminder of where she came from and the truth she now represented. My career, however, was still in a reconstruction phase. The smear campaign orchestrated by Mark's dead man switch had left deep scars on my professional reputation. I spent my days in meetings with ethics boards and former clients, presenting them not with apologies, but with a forensic report of a betrayal. I showed them how the fraud was executed, not as a victim seeking pity, but as an architect explaining a structural failure. By treating my own trauma as a technical case study, I began to win back the respect of the industry. I wasn't the gullible wife anymore. I was the woman who audited a sociopath. One of my first acts with the recovered funds from Mark's offshore accounts was to establish a legal and psychological fund for the Journal Women, the victims Mark had discarded over the last 15 years. I flew Claire, the former surgeon, to a private clinic in Europe that specialized in complex PTSD. I watched through video calls as she slowly regained the steady hands that Mark had tried to break. We formed a private, encrypted support group we called The Audit. It was a place where we could speak the language of the betrayed without judgment. We realized that Mark's greatest crime wasn't the theft of our money. It was the theft of our epistemic agency, our ability to trust our own senses. We worked together to piece together the global map of his fraud. We found hidden assets in Singapore, a small vineyard in Italy bought with Claire's retirement, and a condo in Thailand. I realized that Mark's the number wasn't just a goal, it was a scoreboard. He viewed us as levels in a game he was playing against the world. By finding the other women, I was taking his scoreboard and smashing it. I wasn't just recovering money, I was recovering the lost years of these women. I was giving them back their names. While Mark was settling into his life in federal prison, Gary and Tiffany were facing their own reckonings. Gary, the failed actor who had played Dr. Thorne, was sentenced to 8 years. Without the protection of Mark's money or the prestige of his fake medical degree, he was a hollow shell. He sent me letters from prison, pathetic attempts to apologize and ask for loan assistance for his legal fees. I didn't reply. I gave the letters to the prosecutors to show his lack of true remorse. He was a parasite who had finally lost his host. Tiffany was more resilient and therefore more dangerous. Even in a minimum security facility, she tried to manipulate the other inmates and the guards. She tried to sue me for emotional distress regarding the adoption of Maya, claiming I had coerced her sister Elena. I countered with the DNA evidence and a defamation suit that was so meticulously documented, it made her lawyers drop the case within a week. I realized that people like Tiffany don't stop until they are completely starved of attention. I instructed my legal team to stop engaging with her. I enacted a total block strategy. She became a ghost in the system, a data point that no longer received any input. Maya grew rapidly. At 6 months old, she had Gary's eyes, but a temperament that was entirely her own, calm, observant, and resilient. People often asked me if I was afraid she would inherit the darkness of her biological parents. I looked at it through the lens of my work. A child is not a finished program, they are an open source platform. Her source code might have come from Gary and Tiffany's biology, but her operating system was being built by me. I spent hours reading to her, showing her the world through a lens of curiosity rather than suspicion. I realized that by raising Maya, I was performing the ultimate patch on Mark's legacy. He had intended for her to be a tool for his escape, a biological asset. By loving her as a person, I was neutralizing his final move. Every time she laughed, it was a sound that erased a line of Mark's malicious code. I wasn't just her mother. I was her guardian against the history he had tried to write for her. 3 years after the trial, I received a notification that Mark was requesting a final meeting before his transfer to a high-security facility in a different state. My first instinct was to delete the request, but then I realized I needed to see him one last time. I needed to verify that the bug had been completely quarantined. I drove to the prison, a gray concrete monolith that felt like the physical manifestation of a null value. When Mark walked into the visitation room, he was unrecognizable. The charismatic actuary, the miracle patient, the Marcus Thorne of Miami, they were all gone. He was thin, his hair was white, and his eyes were darting around the room as if he were looking for an exit that didn't exist. He sat down and picked up the phone. "Sarah," he whispered, "you look successful." "I am, Mark," I said, my voice steady. "But I'm not here to talk about my success. I'm here to tell you that the dead man's switch has been completely dismantled. The offshore accounts are empty. The journal women are all thriving, and Maya is walking now." The flash of rage that crossed his face was brief, but it was there, the old predator trying to find a way to strike. "She's my daughter," he hissed. "You're raising my daughter in a lie." "No, Mark," I said, leaning closer to the glass. "I'm raising her in the truth. And the truth is, you never wanted a daughter. You wanted a hostage. I have the DNA tests, Mark. We both know you're not her father. You're just a man who forgot that even the most complex algorithms can be broken by a single honest heart." I hung up the phone while he was still screaming at the glass. I didn't look back as I walked out. The audit was closed. My career took an unexpected turn after the trial. I was approached by a major tech conglomerate to head their new ethical architecture division. My job was to design systems that prevented the very kind of social engineering Mark had used. I became the lead architect for a global truth protocol, a decentralized system for verifying medical and financial credentials. I was no longer designing skyscrapers. I was designing the foundations of trust. I spoke at the World Economic Forum about the psychology of the breach. I explained to the world's leaders that the greatest security flaw in any system isn't a weak password. It's the human desire to believe a beautiful lie. I used my story as the ultimate user manual for survival. I found that my pain had a massive utility value. It wasn't just a burden I carried. It was a tool I could use to protect millions of people. I was finally optimized, but not in the way Mark had intended. I was optimized for integrity. 5 years after the trial, I hosted a retreat at my new home on the coast for the journal women. Claire was there, now a successful consultant for a medical board. Elena was there, having graduated from nursing school, a real one this time. We sat on the deck watching Maya play with Claire's dogs, and we realized that we had formed a new kind of family. We were bound not by blood, but by the fact that we had all looked into the abyss and decided to climb out. We took a moment to toast to the medical miracle. Not the fake cure Mark had sold me, but the real miracle of human resilience. We talked about how we had all in our own ways rebooted our lives. We shared our system logs, the stories of our recovery, the moments of doubt, and the ultimate triumph of the truth. We realized that Mark had tried to divide us, to keep us in our separate units. But in the end, he had only succeeded in creating a network of women who were stronger than he ever was. Maya was 7 when she first asked about her father. I didn't lie to her, but I didn't give her the drama version either. I told her that she was born into a world of complex stories, and that her father was a man who had lost his way in his own lies. I told her that she was a gift that came out of a difficult time, and that her life was her own to write. I watched her process this with a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. "So he was a broken program?" she asked, using the tech speak I often used at work. I smiled and kissed her forehead. "Yes, honey. He was a program with a very bad bug, but we fixed the system." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her drawing. I realized then that the virus had been completely neutralized. It hadn't passed to the next generation. The clean install had worked. 10 years after the trial, I received a small box in the mail from the federal prison system. Mark had passed away in his sleep. The box contained his personal effects: a plastic comb, a worn Bible he had likely used as a prop, and a small handwritten note that simply said, the number was 42. I looked at the note and laughed. Even in death, he was still trying to be the man of mystery, still trying to imply there was some hidden meaning I had missed. I didn't try to analyze it. I didn't search for a code 42. I simply took the note, the comb, and the rest of the contents and dropped them into the recycling bin. He was no longer a variable in my life. He was just null. I am sitting on my deck today, watching the sun set over the ocean. Maya is a teenager now, brilliant and fierce, currently arguing with me about her curfew. It is a beautiful, normal, mundane argument. I look at my bank account. It's healthy, but it doesn't define me. I look at my career. It's successful, but it's just one part of my architecture. I think about the medical miracle and the woman I was in that sterile office all those years ago. I feel a wave of compassion for her. She loved fiercely and she suffered deeply, but she survived. I realized that the true miracle wasn't the cure or the revenge. The miracle was the recovery. It was the ability to take a shattered life and build something even more beautiful from the pieces. I am Sarah, and my books are finally perfectly balanced. I hit the final save on my story and close the laptop. The audit is complete.